Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. This episode, I'm super excited to bring the conversation I had with three wonderful women. They are Mackenzie Cooley, Anna Toledano, and Duygu Yildirim. These three women were the editors for the newest book, Natural Things in Early Modern Worlds. It's a fabulous book, and there's a collection of essays or chapters by different folks that talk about early natural things in early modern worlds. And I was very fortunate to talk with the three of them about how they edited the book and then their contributions as well in the book. We start by talking about how they came to write and edit the book together, what that process was like, their early origins, and how they went throughout by, having three people to edit a book. When I talked with Mackenzie, she was in our bit of the conversation. She had two chapters in the book, and we talk about Bezoar stones and their medicinal purpose. We also talk about ambergris and its medicinal uses and its aesthetic, and also how it had purposes such as for perfumes. With Duygu, we talked about coffee in the Middle Ottoman Empire. It's fascinating history there, and some of the ways in which we look at it in terms of embodiment. And then with Anna, I talked about Azara, who was an engineer turned naturalist, and what that was like, how he used local terms and labels and some of the significance. And then we end the conversation about how we see natural things in the past and in the present, and humans' continual interaction with the natural world. I was quite surprised at how we were able to streamline the conversation so well. These three women were wonderful to talk to. They're super brilliant. I really respect all of the research they're doing in their fields, and they were super lovely to talk with me. But to have four people on a conversation, it just went super well. There was no real kind of crosstalk or people kind of getting kind of bunched up together or too many rabbit trails. It was pretty streamlined, and they were just absolutely wonderful. And we were able to talk about their work with the book, their chapters that they wrote in the book, and also their editing, and then kind of a pitch for some of the work that they can do as historians of science and of knowledge. They're all doing fabulous work, and I greatly respect each and every one of them. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com. I'm also on YouTube, so subscribe, follow, and share widely, and support their work. They're doing really good stuff. And now I bring you Mackenzie, Anna, and Duygu. I am here with three wonderful guests. I'm here with Mackenzie Cooley, Anna Toledano, Duygu Yildirim, and they are the editors and authors as well of some of the chapters in the wonderful book, Natural Things in Early Modern Worlds. This is out through Routledge, and it is absolutely wonderful, which I enjoyed reading, and it's absolutely gorgeous as well. I like all of the illustrations and everything. So if you guys could just kind of introduce yourself, just give a brief snapshot of your lives, I guess, professionally and academically, and anything else that might be relevant.
Sounds great. Well, I'm Mackenzie Cooley. I'm so delighted to talk about this project because I feel like it takes us way back to some of our shared roots at Stanford University, where Duygu, Anna, and I had the chance to meet. But I finished up at Stanford in 2018, and then I moved back to the East Coast and did a postdoc at Cornell and took up a tenure track job at the Hamilton College in the history department there. And so I'm currently based in upstate New York, and we've been, working on this book at a distance for a while with our kind of shared love of weird naturalia that kind of connected us across both continents and oceans.
That's great. Anna, how about yourself?
Sure. So I am just about to finish up my dissertation in the history department. So I was the most junior of the three of us in the program. And my work specifically has to do with natural history collecting in the Spanish Empire, mostly Spanish America. But I came from the museum world. And so I never really intended to do the PhD with the goal of becoming a professor or going into official higher education. And I feel like the book project was kind of this perfect intersection of all of our different professional lives, in that it was this work of really deep scholarship, but also this work that we could imagine appearing at a museum bookshop or in some of the professional museum venues where I present my work. So that was kind of my touch on the end of it. And so at the moment, I'm looking for jobs in the museum sector, but I'm finishing up probably in December, so I have a few months left to do that.
Very nice. Yeah, you kind of I guess cross the finish line. You're right there, so it's always
so close.
Very exciting feeling when you get across it. Yes. And Duygu, what is your background and your area of focus?
Mm-hmm. And first of all, thank you so much for this invite. I'm so excited to talk about the book and maybe for our future projects as well. So I also graduated from Stanford in 2021 when COVID hit. So then I went to Italy for my postdoc for a year, and now I'm back to US. I accepted a tenure track position at the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. So I'm based there for now. I teach classes on Middle Eastern history, Ottoman history, food history, history of science and medicine and technology in general. And we started this project while we were all graduate students talking about natural things during coffee breaks. So that's a very dear project to me.
Yeah, that's great. I have to say, just that has to be quite the difference going from Italy to Tennessee. That has to be a very different experience.
Yes.
So that's great. That's great. Okay, yeah. So you guys have kind of mentioned this already. So I was going to ask, just how did this come about? The way it looks is that the three of you edited it, and that's how how it's listed. I think Mackenzie, you have 2 chapters, and then each of you have another chapter. So how did you guys, I guess, you said the idea kind of formed when you were all kind of together, and then it kind of continued on, but how did it kind of get more form where you were going to have different types of people? Was there other things you wanted to include, but you weren't able to? And how did you guys kind of, I guess, work together on the editing part for the chapters that weren't your own?
Who wants to start off?
Take it away,
Anna. Sure. So we had an extremely collaborative process in this project from the very beginning. So as Duygu mentioned, we kind of began talking about this probably around my first year, I would say, maybe in the program, end of my first year, beginning of my second year, which I've been in. This is my 8th year now. So you can think about how long this project has been brewing. And we were discussing the overlaps and kind of the methodologies in our work, and also the holes that we kind of saw in the scholarship in terms of was there scholarship being done with manuscript sources? Kind of were people writing natural history from sources that they found in the archive, not just books that were printed in big European cities? And interestingly, that question was kind of coming up for all three of us, even though we don't necessarily work in exactly the same geographic areas. And that was where kind of the collaboration began. And of course, there's many, many themes that could fit under that capacious category, of course. And we had, chapters along the way that we had many contributors to the project who gave talks or who participated in other events that we had, who were also not necessarily featured in the book project. But I would not say I wouldn't say that precludes them from being part of the project in any way, shape, or form, because this project, I would say, is much more than just the book. The book is kind of one product of this whole way of thinking about natural history that really brought the three of us together.
Yeah, and I guess we should also just say that Stanford is really a hothouse for thinking about the history of natural history. There are some really fabulous faculty in the history and philosophy of science program right now, um, who are all really interested in these questions about the definitions of life, the way that scientists really quite large, right, have started to consider. The capacity of nature, right? And that's really a story that we tend to tell through the angle of the scientific revolution. But what we're finding is that the more that the global historical turn really seizes grabs a hold of the field, the more that old scientific revolution story that really centers on Europe has been questioned. But so right at during the time that we were all at Stanford, Paula Finland was there. So she's our mentor and advisor. She also has a chapter in the book. We also all worked in different capacities with Jessica Riskin, who works on the definition of life. She was really key to some of the early conversations about defining natural history. And so too was Londa Schiebinger, who's written a lot on plants and empire, on abortifacients, and on really taking botany and integrating it into the study of natural history. And so between that museum studies focus on the history of life, and this like attention to botany, we were really lucky to have the kind of mentorship that we did, that then made it possible for us to launch a site at Stanford that really kind of focused on natural history at Stanford, from which natural things then grew.
The question I have here, and any one of you can answer this, is you talk about it as kind of, I guess, maybe not the why, but the unique relationship or about natural things and humans and making that connection in early modern world. You guys kind of define what that is, but maybe just chat a little bit before we get to some of the specifics about this relationship and this ongoing relationship between natural things in our world in the past, but also currently, between humans, and is there, is that kind of a bi-directional kind of thing, or is it one more unidirectional? Just chat about that interaction, I guess.
Yeah, I think we are all very interested in the new histories of beyond the human, like how we can define a history beyond human beings. And then, but we also have to think about the relation between humans and their environments and natural things. So it's a complicated question, precisely because history itself is always interested in the agency question, right? So when you try to get rid of the human beings, then where you will put the agency? So that was one of the questions we had to deal with. But we didn't get rid of the humans. Humans are there who are part of the meaning making in the history of natural things. So this is what we try to include in the volume. And the other thing is that what is really natural history? So we know that this is the early origins of botany, but when you think about its own historiography, it doesn't really speak to non-Western forms of knowledge, like natural knowledge, as a term. So we talk about this a lot, which I find that in the beginning it was both challenging, but at the end I find it very, very rewarding experience to talk about what do we really mean by natural history. So we try to challenge it a little bit in the introduction, especially why we don't use it in the volume, and instead we introduce the new term nature studies to be more inclusive, to talk about history of science in general around the world.
Yeah, that's great. I like the way you gave that kind of explanation. Is there anything you two wanted to jump in here on?
Well, I don't know. I think that the history of science and environmental history have, up to this point, really developed in these two parallel tracks, right? One is concerned with instrumentation and measurement and what constitutes objectivity. And the other has been concerned with the material world, right? The physical environment that surrounds us and how we can manage those resources, and indeed have failed to manage those resources really well. And I think that this book is a part of this movement to bring together those two subfields, because so clearly, as we see the idea of science on the rise within early modern history, right, the path toward experimentation that's going to be at the center of what we see as scientific knowledge today. This is the very same period that the global environment is most dreadfully under threat, right? And so this is really a book that tries to unite those two stories by following how elements of nature that were studied by naturalists or by scientists or just by curious people became how those objects were alienated from the living nature of which they were a part.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think trying to have this kind of merging in another framework of how to look at these things, I think is much needed, which I think is what made it so appealing, at least to myself and hopefully to many other people. So, okay, so let's start with you, Mackenzie. We'll get to the first part. You can talk about your two chapters, but the first part is called Manipulated. I'm assuming there's for certain things from the natural world that have been manipulated for other uses. I didn't know about how do you say this? Bezoar? Is that how you say this?
Bezoar. Although my aunt, who's a pathologist, works on GI tracts, took me into the gross room to go see them in humans, and she said, "We found another Bezoar." So call it what you want, or just stroke here to think about Severus. Right?
I never heard of this, and it kind of blew my mind. So could you just kind of tell us what it is, what animals this has been found in, and then how it was used for medicinal qualities and for other things as well?
Yeah. So, I mean, I see my two contributions to this book as being like really grody things you find in surprising beasts. So on one hand, that's the Bezoar stone. That's what we're going to talk about at first. And then the other is called ambergris. So Bezoars, whatever they are. Those of you who have read Harry Potter will know that the Potions Master cites one of the prize antidotes that will cure you of any malady is supposed to be the Bezoar stone, right? And J.K. Rowling, with all of the problems associated with her work, nonetheless has a pretty solid idea of early modern history in a way. And indeed, in the early modern world, in a time that magic was real and surrounded in animated collections and potion making was just medicine making, the Bezoar stone was supposed to be the ultimate antidote, right? So it turned out, it's a stone that develops in the digestive systems of ruminants. So as I mentioned, we can still find them in like humans who eat too much of their hair, right? They'll get a kind of Bezoar stone. That's what happens. Don't do that. But so too will like goats, as well as llamas and alpacas, but so too will iguanas and even manatees were diagnosed as having Bezoar stones. And so these are, we would see this as a pathology, right? But in the early modern period, the Bezoar was seen as a key medicament that could be the perfect gift for the man who had everything. So if you wanted to give, your great ruler something to cure himself from any disease, you might want to go and find a goat from which you could remove a Bezoar stone. So yeah, pretty wild definition for this object that once you start looking, you see them all over, at the very least, the early modern period. But it's one of these medicines that never catches on in modernity for obvious reasons, right? We would see any effects that early moderns saw as caused by Bezoars as something that we would attribute to the placebo.
So you mentioned that these unite histories of animals, medicine, and humans. I guess, what did this do for understanding the idea at the time of taking certain things from other entities or animals and having potentially medicinal properties, and also what was, I guess, the kind of relationship that humans had with animals as an object, but also an object to have multiple sources and uses, and finding that at the time. Of course, we have you can have various opinions about animal ethics now, but at the time, what was the kind of understanding of the relationship between humans and animals, and how they could use different parts for different things?
So, I mean, you really got to that question in you're drawing attention to this term manipulated, which we use to animate the first third of the book. So many of the natural things that we draw attention to could be understood as manipulated. And that's because so much of early modern people's visions of the natural world are based on this idea that they not only have the right, so much as the duty to manipulate the nature around them, right? Many of the historical actors who I trace in that chapter are have some kind of Christian belief. But at the end of the day, they believe that all of nature was made for them, for their use by God, right? And that they have the right to access its secrets. And the Bezoar stone is one of those perfect stories of nature's secrets, right? It's literally a magical stone hidden in the bowels of beasts, right? If you just cut them open, then you'll find the divine cure. And so I think what you see so basically the chapter that I have on the Bezoar follows the creation of a global medical market for these stones. So first, there's a reliance on stones taken out of goats. And increasingly, that market is diversified, right? There are all sorts of animals that can provide Bezoar stones. But by the time we get to the early 18th century, there's some doubt about the stone's efficacy, and that market starts to shrink. And the Bezoar stone comes to be a taxonomic description, right? So there are different ruminants that are described as Bezoarticus, as a relic of the centrality of these stones. The point being, though, that the Bezoar is a story of an element of nature that could be ripped out, manipulated, and used for human consumption. And that exploitation was a real motivator for a lot of naturalists and merchants alike in their explorations of the natural world. So what we have here is a history of science and the history of the environment that can't really be separated in their telling.
Yeah, that's very nicely put. So where does what is it? How do you say this? Ambergris? How do you say this?
Ambergris, yeah.
Ambergris.
Choose your own. Pick poison about the weird pronunciations here.
So this has been found in Wales, but I guess and it was used as medicine, but it was also used as perfume. I guess talk about how that realization or that understanding came to be of one thing from a natural source could be used for multiple different things, such as a quality that could be helpful, that is somewhat curative, at least that was the thought at the time, and also something for more aesthetics, if you will. I mean, people used to think of aesthetics as vision, but I guess it could be for scent as well. How did that come about, and what does that tell us about, again, the interaction we have with, because most people don't think about it, but we have various perfumes and soaps and things like that. They come from certain resources on the planet. So at this time, what's unique about this, or how is it separate from the Bezoar, and how did it have these different uses?
Yeah, in many ways, the ambergris story and the Bezoar story are really intimately intertwined, right? You find mentions of ambergris on the same medical lists and old pharmacopoeia, which are old lists of drugs that are the key ingredients you need to create medicines in the early modern world. Ambergris and Bezoars are all on those same lists. So the ambergris chapter is really an outgrowth of my interest in animal medicines. And I was working with this research assistant at the time, Kate Biederman, a fabulous student at Hamilton College. And she'd done a lot of work for the Bezoar chapter, and she kept coming to me and saying, I've Professor Cooley, I've found another mention of this ambergris thing, and I don't know what it is, and it seems to come from Wales, right? And indeed, just in the news right this week, there's been a pathologist doing a whale autopsy off the Canary Islands in Las Palmas, found a piece of ambergris that's worth about $500,000, right? So ambergris continues to be highly valued today, unlike the Bezoar stone, which is, again, a pathological entity. So, I mean, to your point about how these uses developed, ambergris can be used for all sorts of different things. It's a blockage in whales that can be used for perfuming. It's used as a binding agent in a lot of medicines. But I think the one of the most important differences between early modern medicine and medicine today is its lack of disciplinarity, right? The people who first encountered and popularized this idea of ambergris as medicine were not interested in quartering off its different potential use cases. They saw perfume and smelling well as a key part of good health, right? So one of the remedies we found for ambergris is literally creating a perfume with it that you could waft up, shall we say, a lady's nether regions, and that would help her if she were experiencing some negative effects down there, right? And this is all part of an early modern confidence in the wholeness of good health, right? And that's why a gift like a Bezoar stone can be so valuable, although you can't quite pin down what makes it so effective as a cure.
Yeah, that's super fascinating. And it's interesting how this still has some kind of literally cash value, if you will. We're still seeing it currently in modern day. It's very, very interesting. Okay, I'm gonna go on to the next part. Duygu, you have the wonderful privilege of telling us about coffee. I'm a big fan of coffee, and obviously I've had Turkish coffee, which is absolutely delightful. So I really enjoyed your chapter. Could you tell us about to just kind of parachute us into the time frame? You spend a lot of time in the Ottoman Empire. Of course, the Ottomans are deeply fascinating to me. 600 plus years. People study early, middle, late Ottoman. It's such a massive time frame that they span. I guess how was in the Ottoman Empire at different points, maybe how was coffee received, and this subjective experience of taste that became highly valued? It just kind of set the stage for us a little bit.
Thanks so much. So even in Turkey today, like the term Turkish coffee, it's so dense because, if you go to Greece, for example, you drink the same kind of like coffee, but they call it like Greek coffee. So among the nationalists, there are like ongoing debates about what is it, right? But it's actually coming from Yemen in the 16th century, especially in the Ottoman Empire in Istanbul. So coffee's own history is not so much fun, even though it became an iconic beverage of the early modern period, especially of this 17th and 18th centuries. But the beginning of it, the early history of it, is not that a happy story. In the 16th century, for example, when it was coming to Istanbul, Ottoman Sultan tried to ban it a few times because of the ongoing debates about whether a Muslim, for example, should drink coffee or not. And precisely because it's not written in the Quran, Muslim jurists had to debate with the medical practitioners to decide whether it's healthy for someone's health or not, or is it intoxicating. So there were like lots of debates going on because in the 16th century and 17th century, when people were thinking about food or beverages, they were immediately talking about medicines. So almost everything has a kind of like medicinal interest in people's mind. So there were lots of controversy going on regarding the bans of coffee drinking and, of course, coffee houses. But, of course, we know now they were not successful because coffee survived in Istanbul. And then, with some merchants, especially Armenian merchants, for example, it went to Europe, but there were like European travelers in Istanbul during that time, especially in the 17th century. And I would say that, especially again after the siege of Vienna, the second siege of Vienna by the Ottomans, which was a failure from the Ottoman side, the coffee became even more interesting to Europeans. So that is a kind of like history. So you can see the lots of like debates in the 16th century taking place in Ottoman Istanbul. And when you look at the 17th century, the debates about like whether Christian bodies this time should consume something foreign, right? Because it's not coming from where they are living. It's coming from a different climate. So climate is everything that defines what someone should be eating and drinking. So there were lots of debates, but also curiosity about the new, I don't want to say this word, but exotic, this is sometimes how they define it, beverages or medicinal substances. So there are like parallels between the Ottoman side of the story and the European side of it. It's just the Ottoman part is a little bit earlier, 1 century earlier. So in that sense, it keeps repeating itself because, then Europeans in the 17th century especially try to look at the Ottoman sources to decide what Ottomans were doing in order to understand whether coffee was, good for someone's health, or how did they, come up with a kind of like agreement between medicine and religion, so on and so forth. So I would say that was like a complicated history to begin with.
The main question I have from the chapter that you had in the book was, there's this, you're kind of getting there or touching on it a second ago, which was this idea of the body and how this kind of not embodiment, but how for humans the experience through the body is essential. For many thinkers have thought this way, and so you talk about this emphasis on melancholy connected with drinking coffee. I was curious about that. What was the thought at the time historically? And does it have anything to do with the knowledge then or now or what have you about how coffee or the caffeine in coffee is a stimulant and how it can have alterations for some people? I guess you're more alert or things like that. Especially if listeners have had Turkish coffee, it's quite strong for for a lot of people. It's great. It's very, very good, but it's very strong. So talk about this kind of how it was received kind of for the body, and how, if there were or were not changes in this emphasis on the melancholy there.
Thank you so much. This is a very interesting question. So the shared medical discourse both in the Islamic world and Europe during that time, it goes back to the ancient motto which says, you are what you eat. So if you then, let's say you're someone living in France in 17th century, and if you're drinking something coming from the Ottoman lands, should you drink it or not? Because this is something foreign, right? And you should not be taking it into your body, because there's kind of like correlation between your own body and the climate, right? And the environment. So it can poison your body. That was kind of like a shared understanding in the medical discourse of the time. So in the 17th century, scholars and physicians and practitioners were really interested in the questions of whether there's a kind of like epidemic, which generally hit those who read a lot and think a lot, which is melancholy or hypochondria. And they said that, for example, when you look at how merchants, for example, advertise coffee drinking, they said that, you cannot find melancholic person, for example, in the Ottoman Empire, because, even though they are very prone to melancholy, they drink coffee so that then they can get rid of this illness. So, they don't have this kind of like disease, some of the merchants were saying, or, the others were saying that hot beverages, for example, can keep you healthy, so then you will not be melancholic. So because as I said, there's a kind of like relation between food and medicine during that time period. So they were so concerned about melancholy. They think that it might hit to, wide range of people over time. So that was a kind of like advertisement they used, but it has a kind of like medical base as well, because really when you look at the medical sources of the time, in Europe especially, and also in the Ottoman Empire, there was a really, really big concern about melancholy as a new disease, emotional disease. So as I talk a little bit in the chapter, there were kind of like two main sides of the debate, which is iatrochemistry and mechanical understanding of medicine. So in order to understand how food and beverages affect your body, they talk about the digestion system. So all the emotional diseases, they think, were part of this kind of like digestion issues. So the question is whether coffee is good for digestion or not, and should it be consumed hot or cold? It's so similar to other debates ongoing, such as, for example, is wine drinking should be served hot or cold, and whether people really drink water, cold or hot as well. So there were the main debates in the medical discourse of the time, and coffee became a interesting object to think with all of these questions.
Yeah, it's terribly fascinating because it sounds, we still in the modern day, we still have those conversations. Yeah, we still have those conversations about the impact that certain things that we're putting in our body, or in terms of portion size or quantity or what's in it or what's not in it, is still how it affects us, how it affects our GI tract, etc. So it's just really interesting to see for us as humans this kind of interest or curiosity into what is it about what we're consuming into our body, or how things are with our body in terms of food or what have you, that are still an ongoing question. It's still trying to be discerned what is and what isn't. So maybe that was interesting to me, and it was also because I've made the joke before that coffee has become a global kind of well accepted stimulus. People aren't doing lines of Coke well, maybe some people are, but people aren't doing lines of Coke in the morning to get through the workday, right? They drink a cup of good coffee and it's fine, right? I do the same thing, but it's interesting how we have a kind of shared understanding of that, but understanding what that looked like 600 years ago or 500 years ago, and then the chronology of that is deeply fascinating. Okay. Anna, last but not least, you had a really cool chapter. I really liked it. It's Felix de Azara. Is this guy? He was where was he from again? Was it Spain? No,
he was from Spain. Yeah,
Spain. And is this right? He was engineer turned naturalist. Is that sort of a self-made naturalist? Maybe just jump us into his kind of unlikely story.
So he was an interesting character, and I'll preface this by saying that I didn't select him because I thought he was some sort of great example of, someone fighting the empire. He definitely was an agent of the empire, but it's so intriguing that he managed to come at it from such an unlikely place. So he was born in Spain and came to the Americas, what's now kind of the region of Rio de la Plata, which is like where Montevideo and Uruguay and Argentina and the river, in Paraguay, they all meet there. And this was a strategic area of a lot of interest for the Spanish at the time in 1780 when they sent him there, because it was time again to draw map lines with the Portuguese. which happened every time there was a new treaty of Tordesillas, the Pope trying to decide, make everybody happy with what land they were taking. And of course, the Portuguese didn't come because they didn't want to draw a line, because then it would say this side is mine and this side is yours, instead of this side is mine and this side is also mine. So poor Azara, who was there, as a surveyor, not as a naturalist, he was there to survey the landscape and help with the line drawing, just was stuck there for 20 years. And he kind of made the best of it. I mean, he seemed kind of like a weird dude, from all the things that he's written and people have written about him. So he, in order to pass the time, he said, I'm going to start writing about the animals. And so he wrote not only things related to his job, he did a lot of beautiful mapping projects and did a ton of kind of anthropological statistical analyses of the nearby towns, the landscapes. He went, taking the heights of different mountains and interviewing different local peoples to learn more about their customs and, write it in probably in pretty racist style, of course. But all these books are, if you read Spanish or English or pretty much any European language, you'll be able to find them on Google Books, because they've been translated into so many languages since he was so popular in the early 1800s, which is really quite interesting. And now nobody really knows who he is. So he also wrote treatises on quadrupeds, on birds. Those were kind of birds were really one of his primary interests in terms of types of animals that he was really interested in looking at.
So the question I was thinking here when I was reading this chapter was, a lot of the times, and I don't like doing this presentism kind of thing, so forgive me, but a lot of the times people will have this kind of like do your own research kind of thing. And I don't need a degree in this or that. And I can just, watch a couple YouTube videos, read some articles, and it's done, right? We don't need experts. That's fine. That's not what was happening here, right? So there is something about, obviously having a background as an engineer is helpful, but I guess talk about how that may have set him up, but this kind of, okay, if I'm going to be here, I'm going to use the time well, but what was it about good observational skills and then how he documented that with care that was, as you mentioned, really instructive for other people later down the road? Kind of just talk about the kind of difference or nuance of doing something maybe he wasn't professionally trained in or had some experience with, but was still able to treat it with a lot of respect and, was able to be really helpful in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think he benefited from being isolated in some ways in that sense and making it up as he went, because he kind of coincided with this perfect moment in the history of natural history where naturalists started turning more to nature as opposed to kind of philosophizing in their own minds necessarily about various ideas. I mean, that's a very broad brush kind of statement that I just made, but this rise of empiricism, this really big focus on looking at what animals are actually doing while they're alive instead of studying their bones and skins in the museum when they're dead. Not that there aren't amazing things that you can't learn about their anatomy from skeletons and all of these sorts of things would eventually, both of these types of data, skeletal and life data, would lead Charles Darwin to come up with his theory of evolution in the next century. So both of these kinds of types of knowledge were really important to get to that conclusion. And this was the time, the late 1700s, when using your observational skills was kind of a big defense of having local people work on their own nature studies. So it was also in my own research for my dissertation, I'm making the argument that naturalists in Mexico and Guatemala before their wars of independence argued with Spanish naturalists saying that you don't understand us, you don't understand our nature. So humans and animals being intertwined in this ecology that is defined by the place that they're in. And so you cannot govern us. We must govern ourselves. So that was kind of the apotheosis of that argument. And Azara was kind of at the beginning stages of that time period, I would say, from what I know of the Spanish Empire in particular. Other empires, I would be eager to hear about comparative studies. But he coming from, as you mentioned, being really well trained in documentation and also being kind of a stickler for documentation himself, which I guess made him a good surveyor and a good engineer, that he was very good at observing, I see this bird, it rises at this time, in this season, it has this color plumage. So there could be arguments that seeing the animal alive was much more important than seeing it while it was dead, because there were mistakes made about various different types of animals and their behavior. Some naturalists in Spain thought that summer and winter plumage of the same species was actually two different species, or they thought male and female plumage was also two different species, but they wouldn't see them mating. But Azara did for 20 years. So he knew what was going on. And that was part of not necessarily his argument, but his work was used by other scholars who had their mind on differentiating themselves from Spain, which he wasn't really on his radar at all. He wasn't thinking. He went back to Spain afterwards in 1801 and died there. So he definitely was loyal to Spain and was a Spanish guy through and through. But it was interestingly that being isolated in that environment, he didn't, and not being trained in the traditional European way in the academy of doing natural history, that he inadvertently kind of did this semi-radical natural history, which was just very, very minor, very, very minor. But it's like the seed that could, be the start of some different type of way of looking at nature.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the story's interesting. And again, I recently talked to Jim Costa, who wrote this. He's written biographies on Darwin and Russell Wallace. And so that was kind of in the back of my mind. And I was just like, oh, it's so interesting to see the kind of comparison. Is this right that he used many of the natural words to name animals that he observed and documented while he was there? I guess I don't want to make something bigger than what it is, but that seems important though, right? Because a lot of the times you'll have, folks that are, part of empire or whatever, and they come and they name things what they think it means. But I think using the terms from local folks is really important, both historically and currently. How we're able to try or to maintain a type of, peek into what is a local environment. They've been here longer. They've had a lot more invested, kind of cohabitation with the environment or animals or plants. What are they up to? What do they call this? What is this? And using that language, how instructive do you think that was in his situation, but then for further, naturalists and explorers, et cetera?
Mm-hmm. No, it's definitely true that what we call things matters. With all the kind of most recent debates, especially during COVID, of renaming of monuments, even at Stanford, we did some renaming. I served on a committee to take our first president's name off of a building because he was a eugenicist. So what you call something definitely matters, even if it's, somethingus in genus, species, Latin kind of style. And so Azara was not trained in that kind of, the binomial nomenclature that we learn in ninth grade biology of, the Homo sapiens. But he knew how the system kind of worked. And it was just, Linnaeus who was the creator of the system. It was a pretty young system at the time. And there was a lot of debate over what should we use to name things. And eventually it just kind of won out by use, not necessarily because it was the best one, which, VHS or beta kind of thing. Azara knew that was happening, but he also knew that he was finding species that hadn't yet been named in the system, but that the Guarani people there, where he was living in Rio de la Plata, had named these things for a long time in their own language. And those terms were usually descriptive instead of, after some dead white guy, which a lot of the, the species names today in binomial nomenclature are for that honorific purpose. So it's just almost, matter of factly, he was like, these are more practical. I'm going to do this. And so he wasn't, like crusading for Guarani or anything. He just was like, this this seems practical to me. And interestingly, similar debates were going on about the same time in Mexico City. This one guy, Antonio Alzate, who was a Creole scholar, so he was of Spanish descent, born in Mexico City, was a huge, passionate advocate for using Nahuatl in native terms for Mexican nature. And there were some very impassioned debates in a lot of the local newspapers where, these men of letters would kind of collect and write to each other. And Azara probably didn't have access to all of these things, but it was kind of interesting that he was still thinking about the same question because they were all engaging in the practical work of identifying nature to fit into this European paradigm. I want to stress they were not discovering these species. These species had long been known by humans, just they were new to Europeans. So there's a lot of scholarship that you might, if you're interested in this topic and you go back to books that are a little bit older than ours, you may see, Azara was the first person to name this, or he was the first person to discover this species. And it's not exactly true. It's more that he was the first person to give it a European, official scientific name. And that act itself is colonialism. That's taxonomic colonialism, which Londa Schiebinger, who we mentioned before, one of our professors at Stanford, wrote an amazing chapter on how language was used as a tool of empire, even in natural history. So inadvertently, Azara was both complying with the empire and that he was turning these Guarani terms into the European system, into being used in the European system, but also was kind of breaking with it. And then even more, he owes it to the French scholar who actually decided to codify those names as the official names in the early 1800s as the official names in these biological encyclopedias.
Yeah, it's such an interesting story, and it's interesting when people look at kind of global history and we look at places on the earth, and we just see how there might be empires that come and go, but there's been a lot of indigenous folks that have lived in certain places for much longer than whoever was there or whoever won the war or something. And I think it's important to obviously take all points of history, but to really respect folks that have been there for hundreds or thousands of years beforehand, and that history looks much different in places like Eurasia and things like that than it does in North America. But it's very interesting how we have this idea of history. So the final question I have, each of you can answer it and say any final thoughts that you want on the book. The final question is, how does understanding natural things in times past help us understand the relationship of humans in their natural world currently? So it's a kind of open-ended question. So Mackenzie, you want to go first, since I started with you first?
I think that when we go for a hike today, right? We get to put on our in some ways, many of us hike and think with the romantics. We embrace the surreal of the wind in our hair and the rocks beneath our feet. And that approach to the natural world is so different in many ways from that which people in the past had to the nature that they traversed. Right. I mean, Anna made this last point about the act of naming scientifically is an act of colonialism, right? But so too are these different ways of looking at nature. They reveal our priorities, right? So when Columbus sailed the ocean blue and created a desire in the European mind for a world that is beyond European shores, right? One of the ways that happened is through the exoticization, as Duygu has mentioned, of a much wider natural world, right? And so rather than feeling the wind in one's hair and listening to what locals called the birds that rose up from the bushes, at that moment of European expansion, there was a desire to monetize the living nature around them, to monetize that living nature for medicinal gain, for resources in order to just build things, right? And certainly science then became an outgrowth or a parallel track for those two more, in some ways, pragmatic desires. And so I think that natural things teaches us about the ways in which the work of science and the work of naturalism sometimes can perpetuate an alienation, a distance between us as observers of natures and transform us into perpetual consumers who lose a lot of knowledge in reifying that consumption.
Yeah, that's very nicely said. I really agree with all of that. Duygu, how do you? What are your final thoughts? How can we understand, natural things in the past and the relationship humans have with it in current times, and anything else that you want to say or end with?
Yeah, I think, as Anna said, the categorization and naming are so important tools in the history of natural history and botany. So we use our own categories in the book, subtitles. So, for example, copy chapter appears and felt. So all the discussions we have most of the time in this interview are mostly about the material side of science, right? So it's just like brutal instrument of colonialism and objectification of science, for example. But there's also kind of like feeling and sensational attachment to the objects, natural things, right? And this is not something unique to Peter Pan or coffee, for example, but you can see lots of this kind of discussions, the sensational, meanings of the natural things in the minds of the, let's say, European men of science. So it's not only kind of like hard sciences versus, sensations and emotions. They went hand in hand. Even today, we want to think about science as kind of like very objectified and, materialized entity. But the feelings and the emotions are always there. So I think that, and I hope that would also remind us that side of the science as well.
Yeah, that's great. I fully agree with you there too. That's great. And Anna, what do you want to say about this question? Anything else you want to end with?
So I think a lot about the actual physical objects that we still have, because my work in museums, you definitely use those charismatic objects, as we like to call them, things that, make kids go, whoa, and really, really want to get into learning about history or its past. But I interested, and a couple of people in our a couple of contributors chose these. I think about the squid chapter where things got eaten. Sometimes the things aren't there anymore, and in Azara's case, his birds went away. But then we have our lovely chapter on armadillo just before mine, and armadillos are so hard that they have this beautiful staying power. So there is this agency inherent to the materiality of these natural things that makes them either more or less numerous in our current time, which changes the way that we view what nature looked like in the past. Maybe, that we don't have any of these soft, squishy birds that were pretty hard to preserve. They're very delicate, but an armadillo carapace, a little armadillo back, we've definitely got a bunch of those. So not to say that armadillos weren't numerous, but what things are made of has an effect on what remains in museum collections and what people see today of these natural things. So in that sense, the way that people feel and sense and experience all of these objects is also manipulated by time.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's also important. I mean, you guys in the book touch on these ideas of things manipulated, how things feel, what's the preservation, and I think it's important to understand context and history of some things and the lessons we can learn about. It's not necessarily a one-to-one of what goes on in our world, but there's things that you can apply, I think, in at least in a general aspect. And one thing that I have such an appreciation for is history and learning from it and continuously learning from it and hearing histories we don't hear about often. So I think it's all very relevant. The book is called Natural Things in Early Modern Worlds. It is out, I think it's out everywhere, right? I think it's out everywhere now. And it's absolutely fabulous. It's a beautiful book. I've said before that it's something you could put in your living room or on a coffee table, and people pick it up and look through it. And it's very, very pretty to look at, and then they can hopefully read all the contents inside. To the three of you, thanks so very much for giving me your time. It's always a miracle when I can get 4 people's schedules for at one time, especially at a different time zone. So big thanks to all of you, and for doing such wonderful work, and we'll gladly support each one of you as all the different adventures and things that you do within your field. And so again, big thanks. I had so much fun doing this.
Thank you so
Thanks
much.
so much.
Yes, of course.